at your home or in your fields. Roundup-branded herbicides are some of the most effective methods for controlling them.
Roundup was always marketed as incredibly safe. It's so much safer than any other herbicide on the market. Some of the early salespeople would say, it's safe enough to drink, safer than table salt.
It was liquid gold, and it was a revolution in the way we farmed.
If you go down the history of the sort of really bad chemicals, whether it be DDT, PCBs, Agent Orange, dioxin, Monsanto has effectively made a business out of poisoning people and getting away with it.
When I look at the jury verdict, the decision, it's wrong. We need to do a better job explaining the science so people understand that glyphosate-based products are safe.
Welcome to Four Corners. 40 years ago, a revolutionary weed killer called Roundup transformed agriculture across the world. Patented by the US agri-chemical giant Monsanto, its active ingredient glyphosate is now the most commonly used herbicide on the planet. In Australia today, more than 500 glyphosate-based products are on the market. They're used on farms across the country, and many home gardeners have a container of Roundup in their garden shed. Monsanto has always insisted the product is safe and claims hundreds of studies support that conclusion. So do the major regulators in America and Australia. But in a landmark court case in August, a jury in the United States found Roundup contributed to a Californian man's terminal cancer. This echoed a finding by the World Health Organization's cancer research body that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans. Documents that emerged during the trial laid bare Monsanto's decades-long corporate campaign to protect its lucrative products from being restricted or banned. And now in Australia, new questions are being asked about the regulators' insistence that Roundup and glyphosate are safe. Stephanie March reports.
In a barley field in Bogabilla in northern New South Wales, Peter Mailer is starting work. He and his daughter Georgie are preparing for the next crop by spraying with the weed-killing chemical glyphosate. Peter's been using it for decades.
I remember that first drum of that stuff that my father bought was a 50-litre drum, and it cost $1,000. And I remember we used to go out and spray individual hard-to-kill weeds in paddocks. You know, it was liquid gold, and it was a revolution in the way we farmed. Let's grab that other one there.
Glyphosate was originally patented by Monsanto and branded as Roundup. It's now the most widely used herbicide on the planet.
Outside of the organic industry, I would go close to 100% of conventional farmers use Roundup to some extent now. It's essential. We don't have an alternative to glyphosate in the system at the moment. So if we can't use that product, we're back to ploughing the ground. You know, and there's some massive problems in our system if we start cultivating instead of using a chemical solution.
Of all the chemicals farmers use, Peter thinks this is the safest.
If you take the necessary precautions as you would with any chemical compound, the product is actually very safe. And I'm very comfortable in that. I use it. I'm happy for my kids to come and work with me, and my daughter to work with it, and my wife to work with it, if that's the case may be.
1,000 kilometres south, farmers Ron and Charlie Snape have a very different view. For nearly 40 years, they ran cattle and raised their 3 children on this farm in Tilba.
You survive so many droughts and you survive so many hassles in the environment. It's just such a beautiful place. It can be horrific, but then the next day it's absolutely beautiful.
To manage the weeds on their 325-acre property, Ron depended on Roundup.
Charlie only had the exposure from washing my clothes and sleeping with me. She used to complain that I always smelled of Roundup after we used it. When we were using it on the farm, we could actually use it for anything up to a week straight, using it noxious weeds control, controlling along fence lines, and just general farm use. We used it quite extensively.
8 years ago, Charlie was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They can't prove it, but they blame Roundup for her cancer.
We were sent off to a specialist oncologist, and he just said to us, he said, you've got lymphoma. He said, this is farmers' lymphoma. He said, it's common to farmers. He said, too many farmers are overrepresented in the population of lymphoma sufferers. Well, that just made me feel so damn guilty. Yeah. I've done something dramatic to my wife that's probably shortened her life. It's just absolutely appalling.
And I find that to be upsetting to me, because how was Ron to know?
Charlie's now in remission, but they've decided to sell the farm. The Snapes just wish they'd had more information about Roundup.
Farmers are junkies to this particular chemical. We've been made junkies by Monsanto. It's just so quick, it's so easy, and it's so effective. I should have known. But in saying that, the bloody bastards that actually made this product, they should have made us all informed. At least put on that packet that there is a possibility. Make me aware. Make me so that I can make an informed decision that I'm going to use that or I'm not going to use it. But for Christ's sake, just don't bloody hide it.
A California jury awarded nearly $300 million to a former school groundskeeper who sued Monsanto, claiming its weed killers, including Roundup, gave him non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
In August, a landmark court case blew wide open the question of whether Monsanto's Roundup products are safe.
Mr. Johnson maintained his composure today in court as that verdict was read.
As a school groundskeeper near San Francisco, Dwayne Lee Johnson sprayed Roundup products for hours a day, dozens of times a year.
For y'all that don't know, I am an integrated pest manager / groundsman. I get you dirty every day. Some day I have clean days, sometimes I have dirty days. Today is one of those wet, dirty days, right?
He was using a sort of a pressure hose sprayer, so he was spraying 150 gallons every morning. And so his exposure was pretty extreme. And prior to his exposure, his skin was perfect. He was healthy, he had no other chemical exposures. But within 2 years after starting this sort of massive spraying, he developed this incredibly aggressive cancer that, ultimately is going to take his life.
These photos show the painful lesions which started breaking out all over his body. His doctors diagnosed it as a rare form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Madam Foreperson, does the jury have a verdict? All right, can you please hand the verdict to the bailiff? All right, I will now read the verdict in the matter of Dwayne Johnson, plaintiff versus Monsanto Company, defendant.
The jury found Roundup was a substantial factor in causing Mr. Johnson's cancer, and that Monsanto failed to warn of the risk.
Question number 17. What amount of punitive damages, if any, do you award to Mr. Johnson? The answer was $250 million. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this now concludes your service as jurors in this case.
I'm glad to be here to be able to help, but the cost is way bigger than me. So hopefully this thing will start to get the attention that it needs to get right so folks can make a good choice.
And then the remaining jurors...
Monsanto is challenging the verdict.
I feel sorry for Mr. Johnson. I have tremendous sympathy for what he and his family are going through. When I look at the jury verdict, the decision, it's wrong. And it doesn't change the science. It doesn't change the 40 years of safe use, the 800 tests, the agricultural health study. It doesn't change the science. Obviously, the science didn't resonate with that jury. We want to understand why. Because we need to do a better job explaining the science so people understand that glyphosate-based products are safe.
From across the world, farmers have come to America's agricultural event of the year, the Farm Progress Show in Iowa. The big news here is that Monsanto has just been bought by the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer for $63 billion. The company's called a press conference to talk about it, but it can't escape questions about the court case.
I can really say nothing's changed. We had the outcome in the verdict in California. There's really nothing new. I mean, I would look at that as one case. Doesn't change 800 scientific studies. It doesn't change 40 years of use. It doesn't change the incredible value that product's brought to agriculture and to consumers worldwide. And we're thoroughly supportive of the product, and we'll continue to work through the legal process that's available to us. It's a horrible and unfortunate situation with the plaintiff, Mr. Johnson. We have great sympathy for him and his family, but Roundup does not cause cancer.
Bayer's getting rid of the controversial Monsanto name, but insists it will keep and protect the company's products, which earn billions every year. Farmers here are dismissive of the verdict.
It's to be expected coming out of California, where they've got a world of tree huggers and people that do not understand it. Isn't it wild that a judge and a jury out there would render a catastrophic award, and how's the world a better place?
I'm very worried. Yes, we need this product, and we do not need over $200 million lawsuits against Monsanto, or, you know, it's Bayer now, but I mean, somebody has to pay that. And, you know, it's going to come down to their customers. Yes, I'm very concerned.
They call this region America's breadbasket because of the extraordinary amount of grain grown in its rich soil. Corn is the country's most widely grown crop. Last year's harvest netted nearly $50 billion.
Our family moved to Iowa in 1835. They built a sod house and broke ground about 2 miles from here. And we've been farming in Iowa ever since. From the time that the Waltons first came to Iowa, we've always grown corn. They've grown small grains such as wheat, oats, some barley, and we've always had livestock.
Farmer Dave Walton uses Monsanto's Roundup Ready seeds to grow his corn. They've been genetically modified to withstand being sprayed with glyphosate. It kills the weeds, but not the crop. Today, 90% of America's corn crops are genetically modified using Monsanto's technology to tolerate glyphosate.
It's a herbicide tolerance system, and it allows us to apply Roundup to the crop, and Roundup will control any weeds that are present in the crop but won't affect the crop itself. We don't intentionally put it on ourselves, but if it does get on us, it's not so much a concern. We wash it off, we go about our business, but we wear gloves and the proper safety equipment to try to minimize that. But as far as applying it to the crops, I have no concerns whatsoever.
Dave Walton can't imagine farming without glyphosate.
It's not a pleasant thought, really, but it would mean to us that we would have to go back to either more tillage to control weeds prior to planting, possibly in-crop row cultivation, or we would have to switch to herbicides that aren't as safe for the environment and not as safe for the applicator like me.
Across the state line, St. Louis, Missouri is home to Monsanto's headquarters, now owned by Bayer. From this sprawling complex, Monsanto's run a worldwide campaign to deny claims that Roundup and its key ingredient glyphosate are dangerous. After the court verdict, the company's vice president, Scott Partridge, released this statement, claiming more than 800 scientific studies and reviews support the fact that glyphosate does not cause cancer. Do the 800 studies all relate to cancer, or do they relate to other potential illnesses?
All types of risks and hazards and diseases, a wide variety, which we're required to do. When we obtain registrations from governments around the world, they don't simply ask you, does it cause cancer or not? You know, they want to know all aspects of health and safety related to the product.
When Monsanto says there are 800 studies showing that it's safe, we have no idea how many of those studies might be authentic, independent scientific studies. We know that the scientific literature has been corrupted.
For decades, questions have been raised around the safety of Roundup and its key ingredient glyphosate. Now, Monsanto's strategies to protect its flagship product have been exposed in a trove of internal documents. They reveal a long-standing, aggressive campaign of deception and dirty tricks. The documents are known as the Monsanto Papers.
These are discovery documents that Monsanto was forced to turn over to the plaintiffs in the litigation. And so far, Monsanto itself says that it's turned over about 10 million pages of documents. And this has really been eye-opening because we've seen so much evidence of how the company has worked to hide the risks of its products.
For nearly 20 years, journalist and author Carey Gillam has been investigating Monsanto.
We know that Monsanto has ghostwritten scientific literature. We don't know how much. We don't know how extensive it is. We do know that there are papers that they have ghostwritten that are out there right now, sitting in journals, looking to be authentic, that Monsanto secretly had a hand in manipulating.
From the dawn of agriculture, around the world, it was never really a fair fight. In field after field, season after season, perennial weeds waged their war on valuable crops and won.
When a Monsanto scientist discovered the weed-killing properties of glyphosate in the 1970s, it sparked an agricultural revolution.
But then came a bright moment of discovery. A quarter century ago, and at long last, weeds had met their match in great science, energetic people, and an uncompromising commitment to the future of the world. That's the simple beauty of Roundup. A remarkable story, well worth celebrating.
In the lush countryside of Brazil,
farmers and home gardeners everywhere soon came to rely on what the company called the world's most trusted herbicide.
On this rubber plantation in Malaysia, Monsanto's Roundup herbicide controls heavy infestations of noxious lalang grass, which saps the strength of the young rubber trees. Sprayed by hand, the results of Roundup Monsanto's newest development in herbicides are obvious.
Roundup was always marketed as incredibly safe, as so much safer than any other herbicide on the market. Some of the early salespeople would say, it's safe enough to drink, safer than table salt. That was a main push, a main appeal for this herbicide.
But doubts about the science behind the safety of Roundup surfaced soon after it was launched. In the 1970s, Monsanto used a company called Industrial Biotech Laboratories to test Roundup to get it registered with the US regulator, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The lab was caught up in a fraud scandal.
It was found that this laboratory was actually just doctoring a lot of the numbers, just sort of cooking the books, so to speak, on these safety studies. And our regulators in the U.S. went in and did an investigation and found out, how fraudulent these studies actually were.
The EPA declared the lab results for Roundup invalid, along with hundreds of other products, because of the flawed science behind the tests.
They weren't fraudulent results. I think there were methods that were being used that weren't in line with all of the other studies.
In the mid-1980s, a new study prompted scientists from the EPA to classify glyphosate as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Monsanto refused to accept the finding.
This went on and on until eventually in the early 1990s, the EPA decided to just go along with Monsanto and overrule its own toxicologist. But it was very controversial, and in the final decision in which EPA determined they would classify glyphosate as not likely to be carcinogenic, some of their own scientists refused to sign off on that.
In 1991, another company used by Monsanto, Craven Laboratories, was caught falsifying test results for pesticides, including Roundup. 15 people were fined or imprisoned. What did Monsanto do to rectify what were found to be problematic testings?
We made sure that sound science was used. We're a science company, we're a science-based company. We believe in sound science, and we're not going to use data that is improper or manipulated at all.
Monsanto has always claimed that it was a victim of fraud and that it had to spend many millions of dollars to redo these studies. But it's been very difficult to ascertain what studies really were redone and what information the regulators have relied on.
Weeds, no problem. Kill weeds and grasses, roots and all, with a shot of Roundup. For driveways, patios, fences, make weeding easy. With Roundup, nothing kills weeds better.
Roundup Extended Control does two jobs at once.
Later in the 1990s, Monsanto's Roundup advertisements caught the attention of New York's then Attorney General Dennis Bacco.
The environmental concern was, the broad advertising claims that Monsanto was advancing in those days, that somehow the Roundup product was entirely safe, biodegradable, safe for pets and children, and less dangerous than table salt. We knew otherwise. Frankly, they were prohibited under federal law from making claims like that.
What was Monsanto like? He found the ads were false and misleading. Monsanto agreed to stop running them in the state of New York, but not the rest of the country.
And ultimately, it was the fact that their advertising was so adverse to the regulations that they were required to follow under federal law. That really is what formed the basis of our claims that they were falsely advertising, because they knew, by virtue of their filings and registrations with the EPA, they knew what the properties of Roundup were. They knew the dangers of Roundup, but yet they were trying to sell to consumers in New York and in other states a different story.
The Monsanto papers reveal company insiders were raising concerns about the potential risk of Roundup for decades. As early as 2003, Monsanto's lead toxicologist wrote an email stating, "You cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen. We've not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement."
When Monsanto's chief toxicologist says, "We can't say Roundup does not cause cancer because we haven't done the testing on it," there's no multiple interpretations of that. That is their own toxicologist saying, "Yeah, we actually haven't tested the formulated product, so we can't say it doesn't cause cancer," because they don't know.
Monsanto's crisis management went into overdrive in 2014. The company learned the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, was going to assess glyphosate. In an email, Monsanto's lead toxicologist wrote, "What we've long been concerned about has happened. Glyphosate is on for an IARC review." Monsanto launched a PR campaign to denounce and discredit the review, including a plan to orchestrate outcry.
Internal documents that have come out through discovery in court have shown that Monsanto in advance prepared a PR campaign to counter what they were expecting would be a negative decision from IARC on glyphosate. Why, if you're so confident in the product, why did the company need to do that?
Why did the company need to prepare to inform the public of the truth? I don't know if I really need to answer that, Stephanie. That's exactly what it is. There is going to be a mischaracterization of a remarkable tool that needs to stay in farmers' hands. It was going to be besmirched in a fashion that was inappropriate, and we're preparing to make sure the public understands the safety of glyphosate. I think there are extremely valid reasons to do that. I do.
In a way, that seems to imply that we did this on purpose, that we were out to get glyphosate or Monsanto, and that's not the case. We were there to follow IARC's procedures, to do a fair assessment of what the scientific evidence was, and that's what we did. And so it's not right to say that we besmirched something. We looked at the evidence and we came up with a conclusion that we thought fitted the evidence best.
Australian epidemiologist Lynn Fritchie was one of the independent experts who sat on the IARC panel.
People can trust IARC. IARC is an institution that has been doing this for a long time. There are transparent procedures as to what the groups need to do. The groups are the best people in the world on this area. They have no conflicts of interest, and they look at the literature that's available publicly, that's peer-reviewed, that's high quality, and come up with a decision.
After reviewing hundreds of scientific studies, the IARC panel classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. Monsanto was furious.
The industry were very unhappy with the finding that the IARC panel made, and there was a lot of criticism, and some of that criticism was quite personal, and some of it was about IARC and the processes that IARC go through. Some of it was criticism at IARC itself, at the whole institution. So it was quite surprising to me and quite overwhelming, really, the level of criticism that was raised. There's a lot of denial that there was anything wrong with glyphosate at all.
To undermine the IARC decision, Monsanto arranged for its staff to ghostwrite a scientific paper and a magazine article in support of glyphosate. In one email, a Monsanto executive wrote, "We would be keeping the cost down by us doing the writing, and they would just edit and sign their names, so to speak."
There was no ghostwriting.
But why would you use this word?
It was an inappropriate word. It was shorthanding for what he did. He provided access to archival material. Dr. Hayden's later did minor editing to the work, and that was reflected in the acknowledgement section of the paper. It was a poor choice of language.
In the wake of the IARC decision, governments around the world were forced to review whether glyphosate is safe. Here in Washington, D.C., that task fell to the Environmental Protection Agency. Monsanto set out to derail that process in league with the industry-funded lobby group CropLife. Based in the US Capitol, CropLife America is funded by agrochemical companies, including Monsanto and now Bayer.
CropLife is a trade association based here in Washington, D.C. that represents the nation's crop protection companies. We work with the U.S. government, with the Congress, to advocate on behalf of our industry.
CropLife and Monsanto wanted to stop the EPA convening a panel of independent scientists to examine glyphosate. To outwardly just say that CropLife has concerns about a scientific advisory panel being convened before anyone's been named, is that excessive interference in the process by CropLife?
I think that is zealous advocacy on behalf of our membership.
The EPA had invited veteran epidemiologist Dr. Peter Infante to sit on the panel. For 24 years, he worked for the US government assessing toxic substances.
I agree with the International Agency for Research on Cancer's review that concluded that there was some evidence that glyphosate was associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in people exposed to glyphosate.
CropLife lobbied to get him kicked off the panel and wrote to the EPA accusing Dr. Infante of being biased.
I mean, I was shocked because, I was told that, there was this letter from CropLife. I responded it was not an issue. And then, in November, about a week or so after the presidential election, I was informed that, I was being removed from the panel.
How much of an influence do you think CropLife's letter had on your removal?
I think that's the reason I was removed, certainly.
The Monsanto papers reveal the company also pushed to kill off an earlier assessment of glyphosate by the US Health Department.
They wanted to take a look at the toxicity of glyphosate. Monsanto did not want that to happen. And you can see in the documents that they reach out to the EPA and ask for their help in making this review from this separate agency go away. They reached out to very high-level officials at EPA, and they got exactly what they asked for. This review went away.
The EPA's Inspector General is now investigating the agency for possible collusion with Monsanto.
Certainly our scientists know people at the EPA. They have to in order to have that dialogue, to comply with their requests, to comply with their demand. There's no collusion whatsoever.
In Los Angeles, lawyer Brent Wisner's client list has grown rapidly since the landmark court case. Across the US, more than 9,000 people are suing, claiming Roundup caused their cancer.
If you go down the history of the sort of really bad chemicals, pesticides in US society or even world society, every single one of them has its origins in Monsanto. I mean, for the last 150 years, whether it be DDT, PCBs, Agent Orange, dioxin. I mean, Monsanto has been behind all of those. Monsanto has effectively made a business out of poisoning people and getting away with it.
One of Brent Wisner's clients is retired farmer John Barton. He's got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and believes it was caused by spraying Roundup on his cotton farm in California.
I would spray that 500-gallon tank. We would put 5 gallons of diluted Roundup in that. Normally we'd spray that by noon. We would eat lunch, take a 30-minute lunch, and then put another 5 gallons and spray another 500 gallons. We would do that weeks at a time. So that's like the homeowner, the little gallon they get now, that's like spraying 1,000 of those a day. That's the type of exposure I had. There was a lot of times after I got done during the day, my Levi's would be soaking wet, my boots would be wet, my socks would be wet.
He believes Monsanto has known for decades Roundup is dangerous.
I would like to see them admit that they had hidden this for a long time and that they realized it was not safe and that they should have warnings that let people make that, decision for themselves whether they want to use the product or not.
For the last 20 or 30 years, Monsanto has engaged in a systematic and deliberate campaign to attack any science that says their product is not safe and to attack any scientist that has the courage to say something. They have a corporate culture that has zero interest in safety and has only an interest in maintaining the ability of them to sell this product.
It is the safest herbicide that's ever been developed. It has just an amazing, amazing record of not just productivity and use, but also the extent to which it has been examined and scrutinized and studied over 40 years.
Here in Australia, the US court battles over Monsanto's weed killer could have enormous implications for farmers, like Peter Mailer in Bogabilla.
I feel for the gentleman that's had cancer. I've had cancer myself, nothing to do with glyphosate, but the point being here that to actually label or lay the blame at one particular compound in the whole environment is quite a stretch in my view.
In Canberra, farmers are getting together to talk about what it means for the industry.
So you know that glyphosate has been in the news this week. It's been something that we've been exploring in NFF and in some of our committees as they've been meeting. It seems to be as a result of the IARC decision and the subsequent Californian court decision, jury decision. As we all know, Brazil did institute a ban, but that has now been lifted.
The chief concern at this Horticulture Council meeting is losing access to glyphosate.
Yeah. We can't have knee-jerk reactions to responses. We have to back the regulator. We have to back the science. And whilst there is a huge amount of work being done to find ways to do things without chemicals, the reality is until we get to that point, we still need to have access to chemistry.
The industry's peak body says it would be difficult for farmers to live without it.
At the moment, I think that
it's so critical, such a critical part of our cropping system at the moment, that particularly any of the alternatives that we would have at the moment would not only be much more expensive, but they would be considered more higher up the scale in terms of any hazards that it might actually have.
Despite the US court case and the IARC finding, the regulator, the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, the APVMA, hasn't formally reviewed glyphosate in more than 2 decades.
We looked at the IARC report and had an extensive scientific evaluation of the IARC report, and we concluded that there was no reason for us to be changing our regulatory position on glyphosate, and that glyphosate remains safe to use in the Australian environment.
Questions have been raised about the APVMA's independence, as most of its funding comes from the industry it regulates.
That's the system that's in place to ensure that industry pays for the privilege of participating in the Australian market. They pay so we can regulate their chemicals.
How can the public expect that you'll seriously police these products when you directly benefit from the sale of these products? You seem to have a financial interest in keeping these products on the shelves.
No, we don't have a financial interest in it. Our interest is ensuring that the products in the marketplace work and are safe. And I think our track record over the years and our track record since I've been in charge of the organisation suggests that we take that particular responsibility extremely seriously.
If an industry is paying for a service, they're presuming that they will get a service. And it's it's possible that the service then, the government agency sees themselves as a service to industry instead of seeing themselves as a protection for the Australian people.
Cancer Council Australia wants the government to support an independent review of glyphosate.
So given the time frame since the last formal review, we would certainly think it would be appropriate for Australia to do its own review of this literature and to be able to inform the Australian public appropriately about what the conclusions are of that. We would, though, need to make sure that that review was fully independent.
In Canberra, the industry's interests are pushed by the Australian arm of the lobby group CropLife.
As the national peak industry body, we're funded by member companies, the companies that are the manufacturers, the developers, the researchers and the registrants for the crop protection products on the market.
Political disclosure records show in the past 3 years, CropLife has contributed more than $140,000 to political parties, nearly $83,000 to the National Party of Australia and more than $55,000 to the Australian Labor Party.
Well, we don't make political donations. We do participate in some events with political parties. So we won't make just donations to political parties. We're an apolitical organisation, but we do participate and support any conferences or events where agriculture will be talked about.
We would suggest that no political party should be taking donations from any industry, particularly industries that may be the subject of regulatory environments, and that is real cause for concern in the Australian context.
CropLife says it doesn't make political donations, it just makes contributions to inform politicians. Is there a difference?
No, there's not a difference. They're paying to have influence, and we're seeing this across a whole range of industries, and we fundamentally believe that the policy table should not be the subject of industry interference.
In 2014, CropLife claimed credit when Federal Parliament removed the requirement for chemicals like glyphosate to be regularly reapproved. In its annual report, CropLife boasted, in what was a momentous achievement, CropLife's vigorous and targeted advocacy campaign resulted in passage of this bill.
I think an important role for the entire community and any industry and any community group to ensure that when parliamentarians are making decisions, they're making decisions on fact and that they get a wealth of information about what they're making a decision on.
More than 500 glyphosate products are used in Australia today. There are no moves to restrict its use or enforce tougher warnings. But real questions are being raised about the chemical, the company behind it, and how it's regulated, leaving users to ask, who do you trust?
If there's a problem with the product, I want to know because I use it. I'm looking at the science, I'm looking at the evidence, I'm looking at the regulator who I happen to trust and say, I'm still very comfortable that this is a product that we should be using because on balance, it's delivering a whole bunch of benefits to the farming system and to the environment we operate in.
You're seeing France talk about banning it. You're seeing Germany talk about banning it. And you're seeing questions raised about the safety of this product all over the world. And I think we're only going to see more questions as we go forward.
I think government's probably got to get up and have a real inquiry into this particular product. Let us show the world that we are leaders when it comes to actually growing crops and being responsible. Trust Monsanto? No bloody way.